Today we're working on factoring trinomials where the leading coefficient is not 1. And when I talk about the leading coefficient, I'm describing this number that is out in front of x squared. An example of this could be something like 3x squared plus 2x minus 9, where 3 would be your leading coefficient, or A, 2 would be your B, and negative 9 would be your C. That's going to be more important when we talk about solving with the quadratic equation. So an easy way to do this is by learning this process called slide and divide. If you can get these 5 steps down, you'll be able to factor these every single time on a consistent basis. So the first step in slide and divide is to slide that leading coefficient and multiply it by the last number. Some people may have learned this as my AC method. I'm going to take this 3 and I'm going to slide it over to the 9 to create a 27 at the end. The second step would be to factor. The third step is to divide by whatever number you multiplied by. So in this case, we'd be dividing our factors by 3. Fourth step would be to reduce. And the fifth step is to move your denominators. Let's look at this in action. So looking at this example, step number 1 is to slide. So for us to slide, that means that we're taking this 6 and we are sliding it to the end. And when we slide it, we multiply. So that's going to create our new quadratic equation of x squared plus 13x minus 30. That 30 comes from the 6 times the 5 when we multiplied it. Step number 2 was to factor. We know how to factor things very easily, factor these trinomials easily when that leading coefficient is a 1. So we think about our factors of 30. Our options are 1 and 30, 2 and 15, 3 and 10, or 5 and 6. Knowing that there is a negative sign right here, we know that one of our terms has to be positive, one has to be negative. So which one of these options is going to give us a 13? Some of you may have saw 3 and 10. In order to use 3 and 10 to get a 13, they'd both have to be positive. That would not get us a negative 30 when we multiplied positive 3 by positive 10. So we are going to have to use the 2 and 15. So we have, because the 13 is positive, my larger number, 15, is going to be positive. And my smaller number is going to be the negative. Positive 15 times negative 2 gives us the negative 30. The third step in our slide and divide is to divide. Divide by whatever number at the very first step you multiplied by, because multiplication gets rid of division and division gets rid of multiplication. So we are going to divide each of our factors by 6 because that was originally what we multiplied by. Step number 4 is to reduce. So we reduce these fractions. This is going to become x plus, I can take a 3 out of both of those. Please feel free to use your calculator. But this becomes 5 halves and 1/3. And step number 5 would be to move our denominators. So this denominator gets moved out front and this denominator gets moved out front. So my final answer would be 2x plus 5 times 3x minus 1. This would be my final answer. Let's look at another example. My biggest concern about this one is right away I noticed that my leading coefficient is a 21. That is a huge number to multiply through by 9. But what I also recognize is that all three of my terms have an x in it. So that kind of gives me a big clue that I need to look for a greatest common factor, my GCF. I also know that 21 can be divided by 3, 60 can be divided by 3, and so can 9. So let's go ahead and let's factor out our GCF of 3x before we even start. That's going to leave us with 7x squared plus 20x minus 3. That looks a lot more doable. I can work with this trinomial a lot better than I can work with 21 times 9. So let's go through our steps. Step number 1, slide. So I slide this, and I am going to keep my 3x on the outside, that GCF that I factored out, and my new trinomial that I'm working with after my slide is x squared plus 20x minus 21. And again, where I got that 21 was, I took this 7 and I slid it down to the end. Step number 2 would be to factor. So, again, leaving this 3x because it does not go away, I think about my factors of 21. 1 and 21, or 3 and 7. Which one of those is going to get us a 20? Hopefully right away you recognize 1 and 21. I recognize that it's a negative 21, so one has to be positive and one has to be negative. So I split up my x's. I see that my middle term is positive here, so my larger number has to be the positive. Step number 3 is to divide. So I am going to divide everything by what I multiplied by. Step number 4 is to reduce. So I will have a 3x, x plus 3, 21 divided by 7 divides nicely, and 1/7 does not reduce, so I still have that fraction, but don't worry because step number 5 is we move our denominators. So I'm left with 3x, x plus 3, and 7x minus 1. That is my trinomial completely factored. Another example. First thing I want to check, I learned my lesson from the last problem, is to look for that GCF. I don't recognize anything. 2 is even, 15 is not, so therefore I can't take out a 2, and not everything has a 5 in it. So let's go ahead and let's go through our steps. Step number 1, slide. That leaves me with x squared minus 15x plus 14. Step number 2, factor. That's going to give me x and x, and I think about my factors of 14, 1 and 14, 2 and 7. Which one of those is going to get us a 15? Hopefully you recognize 1 and 14 well, and we see that there is a plus sign. So the only way to have two numbers multiply to be a positive is if they are both positive or both negative. We then look and see that our middle term is negative, so we know that they both have to be negative. So I have x minus 14 and x minus 1. Third step is to divide. So I multiplied everything by 2, or that last number by 2, so I'm going to divide by 2. Fourth step, we reduce. That leaves me with x minus 7 and x minus 1/2. And last but not least, fifth step is to move our denominators. I'm left with x minus 7 times 2x minus 1. And if you ever need to check it, go ahead and FOIL back and check your work. Looking at our last slide, I want to note this flowchart that I have in our Schoology account, and this is kind of just our flowchart to decide what we're going to do. Things that we've been working with factoring out our greatest common factor. That's at the top of the flowchart because that is always the very first thing that we do. We've done factoring by grouping. Your big hint is if you see 4 terms, you need to make sure that you're looking for factoring by grouping. We've worked with our trinomials, which is 3 terms. If your leading coefficient is 1, go ahead and factor like normal. If your leading coefficient is not 1, then we make sure that we work with our slide and divide. This is when our A term is not equal to 1, and we worked with slide and divide. So the right-hand side of this flowchart is what your quiz is going to be on.